testability because we have seen those tested before. And so we start with the Basel II framework, and where we have the basic idea still really unchanged is 3 pillars. The first pillar is the minimum capital requirements. And in fact, when people refer to Basel, when there's technical discussion, most of the time they're implicitly referring to the first pillar because these are the rules that determine the regulatory capital. Recall that there's thematically been this distinction between, and oftentimes it's forgotten because we're reading somebody who's forgot to preface with the difference between economic capital and regulatory capital. So Basel by definition is the best example of a regulatory capital. The rules imposed externally on the financial services firm or bank in regard to the minimum capital. You may recall we don't expect at all that the company to mimic those exactly with their own internal approach to economic capital. So this first pillar are the rules around the minimum regulatory capital for the bank. By definition, Basel would mean regulatory capital. Okay, but there's really 3 pillars, and notice the quote here, it is critical that the minimum capital requirements of the first pillar be accompanied by a robust implementation of the second pillar, which is the supervisory review. And so here where it might be helpful to keep in mind that the Basel Committee really doesn't have any kind of international legal jurisdiction over countries, of course, and banks in them. Rather, it's the national supervisors that have that really authority. And so Basel is delegating along with the rules and really looking for cooperation from the different countries and saying that, okay, we've got rules for the minimum capital, but of course we expect each country's national supervisor to be conducting a review of the capital adequacies of the constituent banks. And so there's really, if you look in the text of it, there's there really is an expectation that the supervisors may set requirements above this minimum. See, this use of minimum here is not by accident. There's every reason for the national supervisors to complement this with some additional requirements depending. So that supervisory review ends up being, in the phrase of somewhere in the Basel is a phrase, it's the load-bearing pillar, because a lot of the actual review, enforcement, it falls on the supervisors. These rules without the review and enforcement of the supervisors after all, aren't going to mean much. Then the third pillar, market discipline. These are disclosure. You can almost think about this as disclosure as well. Why does it say market discipline? Because it's on the theory that if Basel, in cooperation with the supervisors, requires the banks to make the disclosures, that the market will help as well. So you see how we've got the rules, the supervisors are helping to review and enforce, and then there's this further support, this idea that if the banks disclose all of that information to the market, that the market will also impose some discipline. Of course, that's under the assumption that the market can process all that information. So we have assess and review, and then disclosure complements the first 2 pillars. And then in terms of key components here,